In the frosty month of December, the people of Azeroth gather from every corner of the land to celebrate the Winter Veil. They exchange gifts, overindulge in food and drink, and share laughably bad tales of the year gone by. But not everyone shares this festive spirit. Among those who didn't was a goblin. He hated the Winter Veil. Yet, when disaster struck and the Winter Veil was on the brink of ruin, it was this unlikely misfit who rose to the occasion to save the day. The story of how a goblin saved Winter Veil starts exactly where you'd expect a goblin tale to start: Booty Bay. Here, amidst the salty sea air and rickety wooden docks, we find Krizz, a down-on-his-luck goblin just trying to scrape by. Krizz worked for none other than the infamous Baron Revelgaz, the ruler of Booty Bay and one of the nastiest, meanest and greediest goblins Azeroth has ever seen. Krizz didn't have the luxury of staying in the Baron's good graces. Somehow, he let a customer down. Exactly what Krizz did or didn't do didn't really matter to him. To Baron Revelgaz, it was simple. A missed opportunity for gold was an unforgivable offence. The punishment was swift and brutal. The Baron and his bruisers roughed Krizz up, beat him senseless, and tossed him out like yesterday's trash. Battered, bruised, and now unemployed, Krizz was left with no choice but to leave Booty Bay behind. But Krizz, being the goblin he is, wasn't out of ideas just yet. And Booty Bay wasn't the only goblin town in Azeroth, after all. Setting off on his journey, Krizz first crossed the Great Sea to Gadgetzan in Tanaris. Unfortunately for him, word of his misfortune had travelled faster than he did. The moment he arrived, the goblins of Gadgetzan sent him packing without so much as a chance to plead his case. Next, Krizz headed north to Mudsprocket in the Dustwallow Marsh, hoping for better luck. And luck he found, if you count being hurled out of the town by an ogre as luck. Beaten, tired and thoroughly fed up, Krizz set his sights on his final stop, to the frozen peaks of Winterspring, where he arrived in the goblin town of Everlock. In Everlock, work was scarce, and Krizz's hopes of a fresh start were slipping fast. But fortune finally showed him a kinder face. A friendly goblin, perhaps out of pity, handed him a business card. It belonged to Woolmort Jinglepocket, Goblin Resources Director for the Smokywood Pastures Incorporated. Jinglepocket was searching for extra hands to help with seasonal work during the bustling Wintervale festivities. Determined not to waste this opportunity, Krizz set sail once more, and finally arrived at the gates of Ironforge. And I know a goblin in an alliance city might raise an eyebrow or two, but it wasn't impossible. These goblins were neutral, after all. The Smokywood Pastures wasted no time in hiring Krizz, and before he knew it, he was set up in the heart of Ironforge, selling Wintervale-themed treats to the cheerful families. But let's be honest, smooth sailing never makes for a good story, does it? Something had to go wrong. Greatfather Winter had passed out on the eve of Wintervale, not from anything serious mind you, but from indulging in a bit too much Thunderbrew Stout. With just a few hours of business left and a long line of excited children still waiting to meet the festival's beloved figurehead, the crew found themselves in a panic. What were they going to do without Greatfather Winter? Then someone had an idea, a brilliant but ridiculous idea. As luck would have it, Krizz was slightly taller than the rest of the goblins, and in their eyes that made him the perfect candidate to step into the role. Before he could protest, Krizz found himself stuffed into a Greatfather Winter costume and shoved in front of the kids to keep the business running for just a few hours more. Grumpy, fed up, and the very definition of a bar humbug, he begrudgingly pushed on. One by one, he spoke to the children, asking each what they wanted for Wintervale. A toy, a treat, another toy, droning through the motions until one small voice cut through his grumbling indifference. A tiny gnome girl stood before him, wide-eyed and hopeful. "I just want my dad to come home," she said. Krizz paused. For the very first time that evening, he perked up. Blinking down at the little gnome, curious, he asked for a name. "Fala," she replied. She went on to explain that her father and renowned engineer, Fritz Fizzlesprocket, had disappeared over 2 weeks ago. With nowhere else to turn, she came to Greatfather Winter to ask for one simple thing, for her Wintervale wish to come true, and her father to come home. Krizz sat there, stunned. He told her that he would do everything he could to help out. As Krizz watched Fala wander off, the trusty reindeer, Metzen, who was far more perceptive than he let on, nudged him hard, glaring at Krizz for his lackluster response. Krizz promised that he would raise a Missing Gnomes report for this Fritz Fizzlesprocket, and that's the best he could do. Later that night, Krizz had finally finished his shift. He decided to keep his word. True to his promise, he set off to file a report about the missing engineer, Professor Fritz Fizzlesprocket. As Krizz wandered through the quiet, echoing halls of Ironforge, a shadowy figure suddenly leapt out from the darkness. It was a dark iron dwarf. After a brief, clumsy scuffle and some choice words, the dwarf finally revealed his purpose. With a hushed voice and darting eyes, the dwarf told Krizz that the tinker was nearly finished with the special toy, and that it would be waiting in the Dunmorrow Airfield just before midnight, and they would be expecting a visit from Greatfather Winter around that time. After falsely agreeing to whatever nonsense the dwarf was spouting, Krizz watched as the figure slipped back into the shadows and vanished. Shaking his head, he continued his walk, until he suddenly bumped in to Fala again. Wide-eyed and breathless, Fala told Krizz that she knew that dwarf. He was the same one who had visited her father the night before he disappeared. Krizz froze as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. A tinker at the airfield working on a special toy. It had to mean one thing. The tinker must have been Fritz Fizzlesprocket, forced to work on whatever strange project the dwarves were hiding. Wasting no time, the pair rushed back to Metzen, still waiting patiently by the Wintervale tree. With a sprinkle of extra reindeer dust and a sense of urgency in the air, the trio took off. Up and out they soared, leaving the safety of Ironforge behind. As they climbed high into the night sky, they turned sharply towards the Ironforge Airfield. From above, all was revealed. The airfield buzzed with activity, and at its centre, dark iron dwarves were hard at work constructing a giant mechanical robot. Krizz's eyes widened as he spotted Fritz among them, clearly being held against his will. With no time to waste, they dove straight for the airfield, crashing down with a dramatic thud. Krizz charged into the fray, throwing punches and knocking dwarves flat. Metzen, with a mighty snort, sent several of them soaring into snowbanks with well-placed kicks. And meanwhile, Fala, brimming with gnomish ingenuity, put her skills to work. With a clever use of reindeer dust and quick thinking, she sent a handful of the dwarves spiraling into the night sky, their yelps fading into the cold air. When the chaos had finally settled, and with the area secure, Krizz, Metzen and Fala freed the captives, and they were some of Azeroth's finest gnomish mechanics and pilots, all held against their will. And there, among the rescued, was of course Fritz Fizzlesprocket, Fala's father, the Wintervale miracle they both needed, coming true at last. Fritz, now free, finally revealed everything that had happened over the last 2 weeks. It all began when the Dark Iron Dwarves showed up at his doorstep, demanding his help in carrying out their devious plan to ruin the Wintervale. The Dark Irons had forced Fritz to lead a team of gnomish engineers to build a giant mechanical robot. Their sinister goal, to disguise the robot as Greatfather Winter, send it into Ironforge, and use it to steal all the presents from under the Wintervale tree. But it wasn't just festive spite that drove them. Fritz explained that the Dark Irons had stolen priceless treasures, artifacts and jewels from both the Explorers League vaults and the Royal Treasury. They had hidden these stolen riches inside the Wintervale presents under the tree, planning to use the robot to reclaim them unnoticed on Wintervale Eve. Fortunately, their plan had been stopped in its tracks. Thanks to Krizz, Fala and Metzen, the captives were freed, the Dark Iron scheme was dismantled, and peace was restored to the gnomes, their families and the city of Ironforge, just in time for Wintervale. Fala had been reunited with her father, safe and sound, and they were preparing to descend back into Ironforge. Krizz and Metzen watched them go before quietly turning to walk off into the winter night. As the pair trudged through the snow, Krizz decided to share what had really happened back in Booty Bay, the secret that had cost him his job. Weeks ago, Baron Revelgaz had fired him for refusing a hit-for-hire offer. A traveller wanted to pay for an innocent man and his family to be killed, but Krizz couldn't bring himself to accept it. For once, his morals had outweighed his goblin greed. With a sigh, Krizz removed his hat and gazed out into the distance, the weight of the decision still lingering. Before he could lose himself in thought, a small hand reached out and grabbed his. Krizz turned to see Fala standing beside him. He awkwardly explained that he wasn't really Greatfather Winter, bracing himself for disappointment. But to his surprise, Fala had known all along. Krizz didn't exactly look the part, after all. But it didn't matter to her or to Fritz. Goblin, dwarf or otherwise, Krizz had saved them and brought their family back together. To show their gratitude, they invited him to join them for their Wintervale dinner. And so, on Winter Veil Day, Krizz, the grumpy goblin from Booty Bay, found himself at a warm gnomish table carving roast boar and sharing laughter with his newfound friends. The stolen treasures were returned to their rightful places, the presents safely back under the Winter Veil tree, and the dark irons behind the plot rounded up and arrested. Even the giant robot Fritz had built was given a second chance, repurposed to place a star atop the Winter Veil tree in Ironforge for all to see. And so, dear friends, as the snow settles and the lights of Winter Veil twinkle bright, we come to the end of another story and, of course, another year. I wanted to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for joining me this year, not just today, but throughout the entire year. Whether you've been here for every tale, every laugh, or just popped by for a visit, your support means the world to me. It truly has been an incredible journey, and I'm so grateful we could share it together. So from my heart to yours, I wish you a warm, joyous, and magical Winter Veil, or whatever you might be celebrating this season. Here's to more stories, more adventures, and even more time spent together in the year to come. So stay safe, stay warm, and as always, thank you for being part of this journey. Happy Winter Veil, and a very happy new year to you all.